The auction barn at Cottonwood Junction had never been so quiet, and the quiet was the kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own pulse. 300 people stood along the pipe railings and up in the sagging bleachers, hats in their hands. And every one of them was looking at a woman who did not look like she was worth looking at. She was small and sun-browned, and her boots were cracked at the toe, and she stood alone in the center of the ring where the sale animals usually walked, holding nothing but a folded paper and a steadiness that seemed to come up out of the packed dirt floor itself. Behind her, penned in the near dark of the alley, the ash-colored herd shifted and breathed. Animals whose blood this same crowd had laughed at 4 years earlier until the tears ran. Now nobody laughed. Now every rancher in the room needed something. Only she had, and she had not yet said whether she would give it. The man in the gray suit at the front, the man from the syndicate, opened his mouth to speak and thought better of it, because he could feel the way the wind had turned, even if he did not yet understand it. But the truth was that the verdict in that barn had already been handed down years before, not by any of these people, but by the dry ground and the cold nights and the slow, patient bodies of the animals nobody wanted. The crowd only thought they were deciding. The land had decided long ago. To understand how a woman alone came to hold the whole valley in the palm of one calloused hand, you have to go back to the spring she first drove up the washboard road with everything she owned rattling in the bed of a borrowed truck. Her name was Delphine Archenot, though nobody up in that high, dry country could say it right, and most gave up and called her Del, and she let them. She was 34 that spring, a widow with a small dead husband's small dead pension, and a stubbornness she had inherited from a grandmother she barely remembered. She had come north from the wet green flatlands because the price of land up in the Ivory Basin was so low it seemed a mistake, and it was not a mistake. It was a warning she was too tired and too broke to read. The place she bought was 160 acres of rock and thin soil, and a house that leaned the way an old man leans when his hip has gone bad. The realtor who sold it to her had the decency to look ashamed, and the ranchers who watched her sign the papers at the county seat had no decency at all and laughed openly. 160 acres in the Ivory Basin, they said, wouldn't fatten a jackrabbit. And then they found out what came with it, and the laughing got worse. Because the previous owner, an old recluse named Tolliver, who had died with no kin, had left behind 8 animals of a kind nobody in that country had seen in 40 years. They were a breed called the 7-Old Dun, a squat, thick, dish-faced kind of cattle, no taller at the shoulder than a big hound, with coats the color of wet ash and horns that curled forward like question marks. They looked, one wag said at the sale barn, like somebody had crossed a milk cow with a stump. They gave hardly any milk. They grew slow. A modern feedlot steer would tower over the biggest of them and outweigh him by 400 pounds at the same age. Everyone agreed the humane thing, the sensible thing, was to ship the whole lot to the killers for whatever the packer would pay by the pound, which was almost nothing, and start over with real cattle or with nothing at all. The man who told her so was named Royce Camber, and he was the first face the valley showed her. He drove out to her leaning house, not 3 days after she moved in a truck so clean it seemed to have never known a dirt road, and he wore a gray suit even out there among the thistles, and he smiled the whole time he talked. He was the land agent for the Meridian Cattle Trust, which was the polite name for a syndicate of out-of-state money that had spent a decade buying up the Ivory Basin one broke rancher at a time, and he had a way of leaning on a fence rail as though he already owned it. He told her he was there to do her a kindness. He said a woman alone, out here, with no experience and no capital. Well, it broke his heart to see it. He offered to take the 8 animals off her hands for $200 the lot, which he said was more than the killers would give her, and he offered on top of that to lease her acreage for a sum that would just about cover her taxes so she could keep the house and never have to lift a shovel. He said it all so warmly that a lonelier or weaker woman might have wept with gratitude. Dell looked at the 8 ash-colored animals grazing the ridge behind him, and she looked at Royce Camber, and she said, "Only I believe I'll keep them a while." He kept smiling, but something went flat behind his eyes. The way a pond goes flat when the wind dies, and he told her the offer would not stay on the table forever, and he drove away, leaving 2 clean lines in her dirt. That first spring nearly finished her. She did not know the country, and the country did not care to teach gently. She rose before the light, and worked until she could not see her own hands, mending the fence Tolliver had let fall, digging out a spring box that had silted shut, hauling water when the spring failed, and doing at night the only arithmetic that mattered, which was the arithmetic of a barrel with a hole in the bottom. She had $1,100 left after the taxes. Feed for 8 head through a hard winter would run near $400. The truck needed a clutch. The roof over the kitchen let the sky in when it rained. Every column she added came out the same. And the answer at the bottom was always a date. And the date was always sooner than she wanted. And past that date there was nothing. She learned that the barrel is always leaking, and the only question is whether you can pour in faster than it runs out. And that spring she could not, and she knew it. There came an evening in the 6th week when she sat on the cracked step of the leaning house with the ledger open on her knees and the numbers swimming, and she thought, plainly and without drama, that she had made the mistake of her life, and that Royce Camber had been right, and that she should call him in the morning and take the $200 and go back south and clean other people's houses until she died. She was that close. And then down in the dark of the ridge, one of the ash-colored cows began to low, low and steady, and another answered, and Dell lifted her head. She had left them out on the roughest, driest, most useless corner of the whole 160, the corner she thought would starve them, and by the sound they were not starving. She walked out with a lantern. In the pool of light the 8 of them lay chewing, fat and calm. In grass she had thought was too coarse and too sparse to keep a goat. The old bull, the one she had started calling Sandra for his ashen hide, lifted his heavy-dished head and looked at her with an expression of such profound and ancient patience that she felt, absurdly, that she was the one being pitied. She did not call Royce Camber in the morning. She did not know yet what she had. But she had seen that the barrel might not be leaking as fast as she feared, and that was enough to make her pour in one more day. The knowledge came, as knowledge in that country came, from the oldest person in it. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Anselm Burgovich, who had come from a mountain village in the old country as a boy some 60 years before, and who was spoken of in the valley with a mixture of respect and unease, the way people speak of a well that is deeper than they can see the bottom of. He was near 80, bent like a shepherd's crook, with hands like roots and pale eyes that missed nothing. He had run sheep and a few odd cattle up on the mountain, shoulders for half a century, where everyone said nothing could run, and he had never gone broke, and never gotten rich, and never asked anyone for anything. He came to Dell, not to mock, but to look. He walked her rough, dry acres slowly, saying nothing, running his root hands over the coarse grasses, and at the useless far corner he stopped a long time by the 8 ash-colored cattle, and said at last in his soft accent, so quiet she leaned in to hear, "You have got the mountain cows." Belle said she supposed they were called 7 dun. Burgovich nodded slowly. "In my country," he said, "up where the good grass will not grow, and the fat cows die in the first hard winter, we keep the small dun ones. The rich men in the valley laugh at us. Then the winter comes that kills the valley, and it is the mountain cow that is alive in the spring." He looked at her with those pale eyes. "The land does not shout what it needs," he said. "It only whispers. The loud man never hears it, so he curses the land. The one who is quiet enough to be poor, she can still hear. You are quiet enough." Then he told her the thing that changed everything, the practical key wrapped inside the riddle. "These cattle," he said, "they do not fight the poor grass. They eat it, they eat the tough brush and the bitter weed. The fat cattle will not touch, and they turn it slow into good beef and hard fat, and they need a third of the water. Do not feed them like the valley feeds its cattle. Do not fight your land to make it into a place these cattle do not need. Let them do what they were made across 1,000 years to do. Turn them on to the roughest ground you have and take your hands off. Del asked him why nobody else kept them. Because, he said, and here a dry humor came into his face, a man cannot brag at the sale barn about a small, slow cow. A man would rather go broke on a big, fast one. Then he touched his hat and went home up the mountain, and Del stood a long time in the far corner among her ash-colored cattle, listening, as he had told her, for the whisper. She began to farm the way he told her, which was mostly to stop farming and start watching. She quit trying to grow tame hay on ground that would not grow it, and quit hauling water she could not spare. And she opened the gates to the rough draws and the brush-choked coulees that Tolliver had fenced the cattle out of, and she let the 8 duns wander where their noses told them. She learned them the way you learn people. Sandra the old bull was the still center of them, and where he lay, the rest lay. And he had a way of standing broadside to a coming storm that told her weather better than any sky. There were 3 old cows, Sui and Braise and Messange, and a young cow named Pearl, who was flighty and clever, and 2 heifers not yet bred, and a bull calf she called Silex, for the flint gray of him. She wrote down what they ate, and when, and where, and slowly she stopped seeing 8 useless small cows, and began to see a machine of exquisite and ancient design that took the worst her land could offer and made it into meat, and asked almost nothing back. That summer, a boy started coming. He was the youngest of the Furlong children, from the failing place down the wash, a family so poor the county whispered about them. A quiet, watchful boy of 10 named Wick, who never said much and never smiled easy, and had learned early that the world did not much want him. He drifted up to watch the strange cattle, and then to help without being asked, mending a gap in the fence with his small, careful hands, and he named the 2 heifers Sunday and Monday, because those were the days he was let come, and Del, who had thought she wanted only to be left alone, found that the ache of her loneliness eased when the boy was there. He never once laughed at her cattle. He said they were smart, and he was right, and he was the only one in the valley who saw it. Him and the old man on the mountain, a child and an ancient. The 2, the world had counted out. By the second autumn, the whisper had become something she could nearly hold in her hands, and she began to keep the secret the way Bergovich had taught her, to keep everything low and covered, like a live coal you bank under the gray ash at night, so that a breath in the morning will bring it back to flame. Because the cattle had bred. Sandra had done his slow, patient work, and by the second fall, there were 5 new calves, done and dish-faced, and thriving on ground that would not have kept a valley calf alive, and the 8 had become 13, and not one had been lost to the winter. That had killed a fine imported bull on the Meridian Trust showplace. 13 head, and every one of them fat off grass she had paid nothing for, off brush she used to curse. She did the arithmetic again in the leaning kitchen with the ledger she now kept more out of habit than fear, and the answer at the bottom of the column was no longer a date past, which there was nothing. It had turned into a small, stubborn plus. But she told no one. She let the valley go on, pitying her. When women in the town spoke to her at all, it was in the soft, careful voice you use with the simple or the doomed. And when Royce Camber's clean truck passed her on the road, he would slow and roll the window down and ask, with his flat, warm smile, whether she was ready yet to be reasonable, and she would say, "I'm getting along." And he would drive off, shaking his head at the waste of it. She banked the coal. She did not brag at the sale barn. And all the while, out in the rough, draws the ash-colored machine kept turning bad land into good beef. Quietly, the way the truest work is always done. The first stranger came in the 3rd spring, and he came by accident. which is how the truth usually arrives in a place that has agreed not to see it. He was a cook, a big soft-spoken man named Ottavio, who ran the kitchen at a mountain hotel 2 valleys over where rich people came to fish. And he had heard from a drover that there was an odd little old blood cattle up in the Ivory Basin. And he had a customer's curiosity about old blood. Dell sold him a single steer, a 3-year-old off the roughest grass, mostly because he asked kindly, and she needed the cash for the clutch she had put off for 2 years. She near gave it away. 3 weeks later, Ottavio drove all the way back up the washboard road, and he got out of his car almost trembling, and he said he had cooked for 30 years, and he had never in his life tasted beef like that. It was dark and marbled, and it had a flavor he could not name, of herbs and hard country and slow time, and his rich fisherman had wept over it, and he wanted every animal she could sell him, and he would pay her 4 times what the packer paid, 5 times, whatever she asked, because there was nothing else like it in the state, and he could sell it faster than she could raise it. Dell stood in her yard and heard at last in a stranger's mouth, in the only language the valley respected, which was money, the thing that Bergovich and the boy had known all along. She sold Ottavio 3 steers that day at a price that made her sit down on the step afterward and laugh until she cried. And still, she told no one in the valley, because being right, she had learned, is its own kind of answer, and it keeps better than boasting, banked low under the ash. But a coal bank too long throws a little light, and Royce Camber was a man whose whole trade was noticing where the money moved. He had watched a widow's leaning house for 3 years waiting for it to fall, so he could buy the acres cheap, and instead he began to notice small wrong things. Her truck ran now, the roof was mended. A hotel car, with plates from 2 valleys over, had been seen on her road. And when he looked up the county brand records, as a careful predator will, he found she had registered 13 head, then 18, then 24, on 160 acres that he had sworn to his backers would not carry 6. He came again in the gray suit, but the warmth had a new edge to it now, a hurry. He raised his offer for the land and the cattle both, to a figure that a year before would have seemed to Dell like all the money in the world. And when she said, "Plain as ever, I believe I'll keep them," he stopped smiling for the first time. He said she was being foolish, that a woman alone could not hope to build anything real out here, that the trust could take her little curiosity and make a business of it with capital she would never have, and that she ought to sell into strength while she could. She thanked him and closed the door, and that, she would later understand, was the moment the pressure began to tighten in earnest, because a man like Royce Camber does not lose a thing he has decided is his. He simply changes how he takes it. The tightening came in 3 waves, the way weather comes. The first was rumor. What began to move through the valley, soft and poisonous, that the widow Arsenault's cattle were diseased, that her old blood carried some throwback sickness, that a man would be a fool to let his herd anywhere near hers. No one could say where the rumor started, but it moved with the ease of something that had been paid to travel, and for a season the few valley men who had begun to wonder about her success drew back and looked at her sideways again. The second wave was the law, or the polite machinery that money makes of the law. A notice came from the county that her water rights on the reopened spring were being reviewed, that a complaint had been filed, and though the complaint went nowhere, it cost her 3 trips to the county seat and money for a lawyer, and a winter of not sleeping. The Meridian Trust, everyone knew, had 2 of the 3 county commissioners in its pocket. And the third wave, when the first 2 failed, was the one that came dressed as friendship. Royce Camber came a final time, not with an offer to buy her out, but with an offer to partner, to fold her little herd into the trust's operation as a boutique line, with her as the pretty face of it, a generous salary, no more worry. He named a salary that was more than her dead husband had made in 5 years. And it was in the naming of it that he made his mistake. The small, greedy slip that a patient watcher will always eventually make, because he leaned on her fence rail and looked out at the rough draws and said, warmly, "You've got what, 31 head out there now, and a fine calf crop coming. That's real value. Let us protect it for you." Dell said nothing. She went very still, because she had told no one her count. And 31 was exactly right, exact to the head. A number a man could only know if he had been walking her ground in the dark and counting her cattle by moonlight. She understood then all at once that he had been out among her banked coals with a lantern of his own, measuring what he meant to take. She said, evenly, "I believe I'll keep them." And she watched him drive away, and she began for the first time to be afraid. Not for herself, but for the 8 and their children. And she went up the mountain to ask the old man what a person does when the wolf has learned the count of the sheep. Pregobi was very old now, and did not rise easy from his chair, but his pale eyes were as sharp as ever, and he listened to the whole of it without a word. When she was done, he was quiet a long time, and then he said, "The wolf is patient, but the wolf is proud, and pride is a thing you can use. He does not want to steal your cattle in the night," he said. "That is too small for him, and too dangerous. He wants the valley to hand them to him, so that it looks like a gift and not a theft. So you must not fight him where he is strong, in the dark, and in the courthouse. You must wait for the day the whole valley is watching, and let his pride walk him out into the open." Dell asked how she would know that day. The old man looked out his window at the sky, which for weeks had been a hard, flawless blue that any mountain man learns to dread. He said, "It is coming already." Then he told her, the last of his wisdom, the thing she would carry longest. "A gift," he said, "is not a thing you give when your hands are full, and it costs you nothing. That is only spilling. A gift is a thing you give when your hands are the only full hands in a starving country, and you could name any price you like. What you do in that hour," he said, "is the only true word you will ever say about yourself. Remember it when the hour comes." Then he sent her home, and the hard blue sky held, and the grass in the valley began to go from green to gold too early, and the gold went to gray, and the men who had laughed at her, small ashy cattle, stood in their doorways and watched the water go out of the world like breath out of a dying man. The drought had come, and it came the way real disaster always comes, not with a storm, but with a silence, opening over the ivory basin like the door of a furnace left standing wide, and everything the valley had built its pride on began, slowly, to burn. That 4th summer the sun did not so much shine as press down, and by midsummer the ivory basin was a bowl of dust. The tame hay burned brown in the field and never made a second cutting. The reservoirs the big outfits had trusted went to cracked mud you could walk across, and the fine imported cattle, the big fast valley cattle that everyone bragged about at the sale barn, stood at the empty troughs and bawled and lost flesh by the day, because a big animal is a big engine, and a big engine burns a great deal of fuel and water. And there was no fuel, and there was no water. The Meridian Trust, with all its capital hauled water, at ruinous cost, and shipped truckloads of cattle to the sale barn at a loss just to stop them starving. And the price at the barn fell through the floor, because the whole region was selling at once, and even the syndicate began to bleed. And the valley men who had laughed hardest were ruined hardest, and none harder than a big, loud, prosperous man named Deverell Poig, who owned the finest spread below the trusts, and who had led the laughter at the county seat 4 years before, who had said the widow's cattle looked like a milk cow crossed with a stump, and who had never once let her forget it. Poig watched his hundreds of fine fat cattle turn to walking bones on ground that had no water and no feed, and he mortgaged what was left to haul water, and the water ran short anyway, and the well he had trusted his whole life dropped, and finally, in the worst week of the worst August the valley had ever known, went dry and sucked air. And up on the useless, rocky 160 that would not fatten a jackrabbit, the widow Archenaux's cattle were alive. They were thin, for no creature crosses such a drought fat, but they were alive and calm and eating, because they were eating the tough, gray brush and the bitter, deep-rooted weed that no valley cow would touch and no drought could quite kill, and because each of them drank a third of what a valley cow drank, and because the little silted spring she had dug open with her own hands 4 years before still ran low, but steady, fed by the deep rock the way the deep old blood of the cattle was fed by deep old time. She had that August 41 head of ash-colored cattle, alive, and eating on land the whole valley had pronounced worthless, and it was the only living herd of any size left standing between the mountains, and every man in the Ivory Basin knew it, and the knowing of it turned in them like a key. Deverell Poe came to her first, and he came the way the old man had said the humbled always come, in shame he could barely carry. He drove up the washboard road in a truck he had not washed in a month, and he stood in her yard, turning his hat in his hands, the loud man gone quiet at last, and he could not for a while look at her. Then he said that his well had failed, and his cattle were dying, and he had heard, he did not know if it was true, that her spring still ran, and he had come to ask, to beg, whether she would let him water even a few of his best animals off it. And he knew, he said, his voice breaking on it, that he had no right on earth to ask her for a cup of water. Not after the things he had said, and there it was. The choice the old man had promised her, laid in her hands, in her own dusty yard. She could have named any price. She could have taken his ruined ranch for the water in her spring, and no court would have called it robbery, only trade. She looked at Deverell Poag, at the fear and the shame in a face that had only ever shown her contempt, and she felt the years of the soft, careful, pitying voices, and she felt, too, the deeper thing under it, the thing the old man had planted. And she said, "You can water your cattle at my spring, Mr. Poag." She said, "I'll not take your ranch for it." And the big man put his hat over his face and wept in her yard. And Wick Furlong, who was 13 now and there most days, showed him quietly where to bring the trucks. But she did not yet know that Royce Camber had heard of the failing wells too, and that his pride had begun at last to walk him out into the open, exactly as the old man on the mountain had foretold. Camber's move came at the emergency meeting. The county called in the auction barn at Cottonwood Junction, when the drought had gone on so long that the valley men, ruined and desperate and frightened, gathered to see whether anything could be saved. And Royce Camber stood up in his gray suit before 300 broken people and made the pride's last mistake in the open. He had a plan, he said, warmly, to save the Ivory Basin. The Meridian Trust, out of its deep concern for the community, would establish a central cattle reserve and water cooperative, and it would need breeding stock that could survive the changed climate, and by great good fortune, such stock existed right here in the valley. And wait. And the trust was prepared to acquire the widow Arsenault's herd and her spring, and manage them for the benefit of all at a fair price, so that the whole valley might rebuild on this hardy blood in the years to come. It was smoothly done. It was almost beautiful. He made the theft sound like salvation, and he had timed it for the hour of greatest fear, and half the room, in their desperation, began to nod. And then he made the slip that a proud man always makes when he thinks the win is his, because he could not resist the flourish of expertise. And he said, "We know precisely what we are dealing with here. 41 head of prime old-blood breeding stock, we have assessed it thoroughly." And into the barn's dead silence Dell, who had not meant to speak, heard her own voice rise, quiet but carrying to every rail. 41, she said. "That's a near count, Mr. Camber. Funny thing, I never told a living soul my count. The last time you gave me my number to the head, it was 31. And it was right, too. Right to the head. And I'd told nobody that either." She let it sit. "Now, how," she asked, "does a man who's never once been welcome on my land come to know my cattle better than I know them myself, unless he's been walking my ground in the dark with a lantern, counting what he means to take? Quoi?" The barn went from silence to a low-rising murmur, and 300 ruined people turned and looked at the man in the gray suit, and saw, all at once and all together, what they had not let themselves see for 10 years, that he had never been their neighbor and never their friend. that he was the wolf who had bought their valley one broke man at a time, and now meant to buy the last thing left, and had been creeping in the dark to count it. Royce Camber opened his mouth and found nothing in it, and the flat, warm smile died on his face for good. Then Dell stepped down into the ring, into the very spot where 4 years before her cattle had been laughed at until men wept. And she said the thing the old man had told her was the only true word a person ever says. She said she would not sell her herd nor her spring to the Meridian Trust, not for any price it could name. Because a thing meant to feed a valley should never belong to a man who feeds on valleys. But, she said, and here her plain voice gentled, she had not saved the last 8 head of a breed everyone forgot in order to sit on them like a dragon in the 1 year they were worth having. Her hands, she said, were the only full hands in a starving country, and the old man had taught her that what you do in that hour is the only true word you will ever say about yourself. So she would open her spring to any man in the valley whose well had failed, for nothing, for as long as the drought held, and she would sell breeding stock, dun bulls and dun heifers, the old hardy blood, to any rancher in the basin who wanted to rebuild on cattle that could live in the country as it truly was. She would not charge them for the blood, she said, for the blood was a gift come down 1,000 years from mountain people poorer than any of them, and she had no right to sell what she had been given. She would charge them only for the work of her hands and the years of her watching. A fair wage and no more, the way you pay a man for labor and not for grace. And she looked around the barn at the men who had laughed and said, "You called them a milk cow, crossed with a stump. Turns out a stump is what's left standing when the fire's gone through." The turn came all at once, the way the old man said it would, after all the long years of restraint. Somewhere in the back, a man took off his hat, and then another, and then it went through the whole barn like wind through gray grass, 300 heads bared to a small sun-browned widow standing in the sail ring, and Deverell Poeg stood up with the tears still on his face and said, loud as he had ever laughed, that he'd buy the first bull and pay full wages for it, and any man who took the trust's side against this woman would answer to him. And Royce Camber, who had come to the barn to walk out its master, walked out its outcast instead, alone. To a truck no one helped him find, defeated not by money, nor by law, nor by any weapon he understood, but by simple decency spoken plain in the 1 hour when it cost the speaker everything to speak it. His backers pulled out of the ruined valley within the year, and the Meridian Trust showplace, with all its dead troughs and its bones of imported cattle, went eventually and quietly onto the market, and it was bought, in time, by a cooperative of small ranchers running dun cattle, and nobody thought that was funny at all. The rains came in the last week of September, the way they come after such a summer. Not gently, but all at once. A black wall off the mountains and 3 days of water hammering the dust back into earth, and the ivory basin drank and drank and did not seem able to stop. Dell stood on the mended step of her no longer leaning house and watched the rough draws run green within the fortnight, the tough gray brush and the bitter weed greening, first because they were made for that ground, and among them her ash-colored cattle, fatter now, and near them the growing herds of the men who had come to her spring, dun cattle spreading back across a valley that had forgotten them. The soft, careful, pitying voices were gone. When she went to town, now the women spoke to her as an equal, and the men touched their hats. And she was no longer the widow who had thrown her money away, nor the fool, nor the woman alone, but simply Del Arsenault, who had known what the whole valley forgot, who had saved the last 8 head of a breed nobody wanted and given their blood back to the country that had scorned her. Ottavio, the cook, could not get enough of her beef, and neither could the 3 fine restaurants that followed him, and the State Cattlemen's Association, which 4 years before would not have let her through the door, sent men up the washboard road to ask, respectfully, whether she might speak at their winter meeting on the old hardy blood. She said she believed she would. Old Anselm Bregovich lived to see the rains, though not by much, and on one of the last good afternoons Dell walked up the mountain to sit with him, and they said little, in the way of people who have already said the true things. He looked out at the greening country and at the dun cattle scattered like ash-colored stones across the far hills, spreading, coming home, and his pale eyes were satisfied. "The land does not shout," he said again softly. The last time she would hear him say it, it only whispers what it needs, and the loud man never hears, so he curses it and it kills him. You were quiet enough to hear. That is the whole of it. He was gone before the first snow, and Dell buried a live coal of grief that never quite went out, and banked beside it the whole of what he had given her. But the boy Wick was a young man now, and a fine hand, and there was work and there was living to do. And on a cold, bright morning that first winter after the rains, out in the rough draw where it had all begun, an old cow named Suey, who should not by any reckoning have had another calf in her, lay down in the frost-silvered brush, and stood up an hour later beside a wet, staggering, dish-faced, dun heifer calf. Ash-colored and small, and made across 1,000 years for exactly this hard country. And Dell knelt in the cold grass beside them, calloused, hand steady, and named her Alb, which is the word in the old tongue for the first gray light before the sun, and thought that the land, which remembers everything the farmer forgets, had whispered its verdict long ago, and that she had only at last been quiet enough to hear it.
I think I lost Raichu, so I have to bring him back. Oh, it's because we fell in the lava and then just left. Oops, my bad. Nah, you're good, Julia. Hey, I'm a cozy variety streamer and saw that you were a variety streamer, and the vibes here were chill and knew I found my place to leave my community. Oh, thanks, Ducky. That's so sweet of you. Thank you so much. Well, welcome in, everybody. Let's go back to Rocky. Let's see, and my teacher's so technical. She wants every little thing right. Ugh. That is annoying, Maju. I mean, like, from an educational perspective, I get it, but yeah, that's like super annoying. I also love the sweaty gamer by day and cozy gamer by night. Oh, thanks, Ducky. Yeah, I also have that on there so that people don't get like surprised when I'm not playing a cozy game when they log in and like watch the stream sometimes. Let's see. I was like, how do we only have one berry from that? I think it's because one of the Pokemon just eats all the berries off of that thing. Okay. Come here. People actually get upset that a streamer isn't doing what they want is wild to me. Yeah, it is kind of weird, Ellie. But people do be people in.